Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Just want to point your attention to the fact that this webinar will be interpreted into Spanish. So you can select the icon for interpretation and click on Spanish if you would like to participate that way. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this very important and timely discussion on strategies to address the epidemic of gun violence in the Americas. My name is Rachel Stoll, and in addition to being the moderator for today's event, I'm also the Vice President at the Stimson Center, and I direct our conventional defense program, which aims to reduce risk and minimize harm associated with the global arms trade. To start, I must say that I'm encouraged that we are holding this event today and that all of you have chosen to join us, which I think illustrates the growing concerns among policymakers, civil society, and global health stakeholders regarding the horrific violence we're witnessing across the Americas that is fueled by the cheap and easy access to small arms. I also think that discussions like this one offer an important antidote to one of the long-standing barriers to meaningful improvements in the global gun violence crisis. For too long, work on gun violence has remained stratified, disaggregated among disparate practitioner communities in the fields of policy, law, gun control, international security, and health, among others. And while each of these communities has endeavored to address discrete elements of gun violence work, we have often missed opportunities for synergies across our work. Fortunately, and thanks in no small part to the great work of the people who you'll be hearing from today, discussions like this one reflect a promising trend towards considering the interconnectedness of the gun violence crisis and its humanitarian, public health, arms control, international development, and foreign policy dimensions. These novel approaches are producing innovative research and perspectives that I hope will unlock solutions to quell what continues to be the unimaginable damage done by those who wield guns. And we all know that the need for solutions could not be more desperate, especially in the Americas. Across Latin America, guns continue to be the principal instruments fueling ecosystems of intense violence and insecurity. According to the United Nations, intentional homicide rates in the Americas are nearly 3 times the global average and more than 7 times the rate seen in Asia or Europe. Indeed, despite being home to just 8% of the world's population, the region can claim 33% of global homicides, the majority of which are committed using firearms. Despite these realities, the region continues to be awash with both illicit and legal small arms, many coming from the United States. In fact, a US Government Accountability Office report from earlier this year found that of the 27,000 guns subject to ATF tracing requests from Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, 40% came from the United States. The study also found that nearly half of those weapons were not a result of illicit smuggling, as is often conventional wisdom, but rather were diverted from legitimate sources, raising serious concerns for the tens of thousands of weapons legally exported from the United States to the region each year. Similarly, a recent study from Mexico using ballistic tracing technology suggests that a staggering 70% of the gun crimes committed in that country alone were done so with weapons sourced from the United States. No matter the source, guns and the destruction they deal are driving an epidemic of violence that infects nearly all aspects of life in these communities. The implications reach far beyond the immediate life and death consequences and are truly shaping crises in economic development, political stability, crime, forced migration, and health. This is all why I am so pleased to be participating in an event as part of the 2022 Consortium of Universities for Global Health and alongside my colleagues at the Medical College of Wisconsin. And I'm especially pleased to be joined by such an incredible collection of experts to help us interrogate the issue of gun violence in the Americas from so many different but inextricably linked perspectives. So we've divided today's meeting into two sessions. Part one will focus on the scope of gun violence, focusing on Mexico and Central America and how this has adversely affected people and communities, resulting in a healthcare crisis, a public health epidemic, and a humanitarian tragedy. Then we'll take a very short break and return for part two, which will focus on the strategies and approaches to address firearms and the bullets they carry. Before I introduce our first speaker, a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and it will be shared publicly. You may use the Q&A function that's located at the bottom of your screen to post your comments or questions. And we do want this to be as interactive as we can, so we do want to hear from you. You may also use the chat function to post any comments. You may feel free to introduce yourself. You can offer some perspectives and ideas throughout this webinar, and we'll be happy to address any questions that you have. So for our first session, we're going to hear from Dr. Arturo Cervantes, who will set the stage by walking us through the very real effects of gun violence in the Americas and about the continuous flow of US weapons, both legal and illicit, into the region. By way of short introduction, Dr. Cervantes is a professor and chair of public health, Faculty of Health Sciences at Anáhuac University in Mexico, where he has worked tirelessly to bring health professionals, human rights advocates, arms trade specialists, and violence prevention activists to address gun violence in Mexico and Central America. Dr. Cervantes is an active member of WHO's Violence Prevention Alliance and a founding member of the Network to Prevent Gun Violence in the Americas. As if he doesn't have enough work on his plate, Dr. Cervantes also happens to be the president of the National Alliance for Road Safety, a non-governmental group working to save lives from road traffic injuries, as well as an anti-corruption and integrity trainer for Alliance for Integrity. Arturo, I'm very pleased to welcome you and give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you for the introduction, and hello to all my fellow panelists and to the audience members. Can you see my screen? Is that correct? Excellent. So it's a privilege from Anáhuac University in Mexico to be today participating in this satellite session of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. It's a third year in a row where Dr. Steve Hagarten and the recently created Network to Prevent Gun Violence in the Americas has participated with this important topic. So today I'm happy to speak about strategies. And as Rachel mentioned, we are part of the Global Campaign for Violence Prevention and the Violence Prevention Alliance, which is operating since the year 2006 out of the World Health Organization, with many, we're standing in the shoulders of giants in the field of violence prevention. So I wanted to start these few minutes of my presentation to share with you a definition that in public health has been used to protect against major health threats to the population. And that is a public nuisance, which is defined as an act, condition, or thing that is illegal because it interferes with the rights of the public generally, of the general public. This is related to an obnoxious or dangerous person or groups of persons who are committing these acts or conditions. And there's many examples in public health about public nuisance lawsuits regarding air pollution or water pollution in the most common cases. But today, throughout this panel, throughout the next couple of hours, we're going to speak about an epidemic that has been silent for many decades, and that is harming Mexico and Central America and Latin American countries in tremendous ways. We're going to speak about an epidemic that is fueled by guns and ammunition that has been going on for decades. An epidemic that feeds corruption, impunity, insecurity, delinquency that are impeding development in our countries. Just keep in mind the following. Today, in Mexico, in my country, 100 persons are going to die today, on average, from a homicide. Of these, 73 are going to die today in Mexico with US sourced weapons and ammunition. And remember that the homicides are the tip of the iceberg. Today, we expect more than 1,000 people to be injured by guns officially registered, but maybe more like 15,000 people being hurt by the consequences of armed violence within our country. Today, we will have at least 3,000 people going to the hospital. Many of them will remain with a permanent disability because of a gunshot wound. And this is just one single day. For the last 15 years, we have seen an incredible rise in homicide mortality rates in the country. Whereas in 2007, we had the lowest historical point in the previous century, the lowest historical points in homicides per 100,000 population. This number has continued rising and rising and rising. And today, the global homicide rate in Mexico is close to 30 deaths per 100,000 Mexicans. And this is intimately related. There's a very strong association between the guns produced and or imported into the United States, all the gun manufacturing and imports into the United States are closely related to the homicide epidemic, and not only to the homicide epidemic, to all the developmental challenges that violence, delinquency, corruption, and organized crime implicate. The correlation is close to 80%, but the implications are tremendous. In these figures, you can see the red is the causes of death. The colors, the squares, the rectangles, are the causes of death. In red and yellow, you see suicide and homicide. And you can see the first column, which is the total rates, 7th cause of death in 2015. But the first cause of death for young Mexicans from 5 all the way to 44 years of age. And I'm going to skip years to 2020. And from 20,000 homicides, we jumped all the way to 36,700 homicides as the 7th leading cause of death. You can see that COVID and viruses and respiratory conditions took the lead in 2020, but it's still the 3rd cause of death for 5 to 14 years old and 15 to 34-year-olds. It's an epidemic that is affecting youth males. And now we have monthly homicides with firearms quantifying at close to 3,000 monthly homicides in the country because of firearms. And firearms, mainly sourced from the United States, are present in more than 70% of all the indictments for gun trafficking and for gun crimes. 7 out of 10 crimes, 7 out of 10 homicides are committed with US sourced weapons. And homicides are just the tip of the violence iceberg, because what about robberies? What about kidnappings? What about hospitalizations and injuries? The homicide is just the tip of the iceberg. And we have been working to quantify the total impact of armed robberies, of robberies to businesses, of property crimes, of vehicle robberies, of robberies during mass transport or inside transport systems. And the impacts are enormous. We estimate that yearly close to $80,000 million, $80 billion in US figures are lost every year. And close to $1.2 trillion could be saved if only prevention would be implemented. So I could go on and on for many minutes speaking about the impacts of this harsh reality. You have newspapers from Ciudad Juarez, and you can see in the scale, the red neighborhoods have rates of homicide of close to 200 homicides per 100,000 people. This is much more than countries at war, that Afghanistan in its worst times of crisis. You have communities where young people are sicarios or paid assassins that are just killing people for a salary. You have the news all the time, the prime time news in the country about homicides and feminicides on the rise. We have incredible massacres every 5 or 6 days. You've got groups of 10, 15, 17 people being assassinated. We've had the most political assassinations happening in the last few years during election periods where all the public figures many public figures are being killed. Look at the rates of 73, 67, 66 per 100,000 inhabitants. These are rates similar to countries at war. And you have a migration of the epidemic of violence and armed robberies into urban centers throughout the northern countries. Things are getting worse and worse, and there's specific hotspots where women are being killed. You see the headlines of feminicides and women being killed increasingly. More than 3 children are killed every day in the country as part of those drastic figures. So every day, more than 10 women are killed. Domestic violence has seen an increase, a tremendous increase over the last few years. And something that these newspaper clippings are illustrating that's very grave and associated with this environment, toxic environment that guns create, is impunity. 9 out of 10 homicides in the country do not have justice. The person that committed it is free and running and probably committing much more crimes. In those crimes committed with intention to hurt the other person, 87% the justice system fails absolutely by not bringing those responsible to justice. So this panel and this meeting today is going to be very interesting because we're putting the focus on one of the main vectors for this public health epidemic, which is guns and ammunition, which are coming and have been coming for decades north to south of the US border and flooding our countries and flooding the hands of criminals and the hands of organized crimes and the hands of citizens and wreaking havoc among our communities. What good is it that we have such an incredible palace for justice and for human universal agreements? What good is it if we have an international bill of human rights that is not respected, that is practically ignored? What about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? How many articles are being continuously violated because of policies that are undermining development and the exercise of human rights in Mexico and in Central American countries? What about the covenants for civil and political rights, or even economic, social, and cultural rights, which we all agreed upon and were the basis for the foundation of the League of Nations and then the United Nations? What about all these important documents that are ignored? Outside of the Washington National Academy of Medicine, Institute of Medicine, lies this statue of Albert Einstein with an incredible inscription that reads, "The right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true." And I mention this because I think we could all be aware of a simple fact that the United States shows willful neglect of Mexico and its southern neighbors. Willful neglect. Out in the open, there are policies and actions that are an outright threat to the well-being of our people and that impede regional development. And these threats have to do with your inept arms policies and the burdens that they have placed currently and have been placing over the last 40 decades in Latin American countries. Remember, guns do not expire. A gun that was sold 40 years ago, legally or illegally, and that it entered a Mexico or a Latin American country can still be loaded with bullets and is still being used. So the continued sales piled up on top of all the existing inventories are tremendous. And it's, as Rachel said, not only the illegal transfer of guns, but also the legal transfer of guns and ammunitions ends up hurting our population. So keep in mind this definition of a public nuisance when we are discussing the topics during this panel. And most importantly, hopefully you also become an advocate for truth, for a truth that has been kept in silence many decades about what is truly feeding the underdevelopment of our countries. The World Bank and international development agencies agree that violence prevention should be an economic development priority. And there's plentiful evidence that the risk factors and the root causes for interpersonal violence are measurable, and we can attend to these risk factors and root causes with evidence-based interventions at different levels of the individual, the families, the communities, and the environments. There is a whole range of science-based violence prevention initiatives that could be tackled. And finally, let me end with a message of hope, a message for the future, a message that has to do with the goals to transform our world of Agenda 2030. These sustainable development goals have been worked upon for many decades, I would say, and polished, whereas the Intergovernmental Violence Prevention Science Group has identified many things that work. And let me just briefly state one of these roadmaps of violence prevention evidence that we have within our reach and that we will be discussing. And this is the SDG 16 plus. If you haven't heard of it, this is a call of action to change our world. And Mexico is one of the pathfinder countries that are planning to deliver the 2030 agenda for peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. There are many countries alongside this important initiative with a long-term plan and a roadmap of how to achieve peaceful, just, and inclusive society. This is a call of action to change our world, and this panel is used to invite you to join us. If we want to build peaceful societies, just societies, and inclusive societies, of course, we have SDG 16, which sets 12 targets for promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development and providing access to justice for all and accountable institutions at all levels. But this goal should not be seen in isolation. There's 24 targets from 7 other SDGs that directly measure an aspect of peace, inclusion, or access to justice. So this is the shift from SDG 16 to SDG 16 plus, and to the motive behind the pathfinders for SDG 16 plus. If we want peaceful societies, let's look at all those sustainable development goals that are related to a peaceful society. All forms of violence, SDG 16.1, violence against children, 16.2, safe migration. What about the arms flow? What about safe public spaces? So it's Sustainable Development Goal 4, 11, 8, 10, 5. They all have to do with the intricacies of obtaining a peaceful society. What about a just society? As well, there are many sustainable development goals that have specific targets that aim towards justice in our societies. What about inclusion? There's also many sustainable development goals that have to do with inclusion. Inclusion to financial systems, to global governance, policies for poverty eradication, tax collection, violence prevention. There's many SDGs related to violence prevention. And SDG 16 plus Pathfinders also discusses the transformative strategies that are needed. We need to invest in prevention so that societies and people reach their full potential. Mexico and other countries need to transform their institutions so that we can meet the aspirations for more prosperous, inclusive, and sustainable futures. And we should involve and empower people so that they can work with us to fulfill their own potential. Aside transformative strategies, 9 catalytic actions have been identified, and I encourage all of you to look into the SDG 16.plus website so that you can understand more about the transformative strategies and catalytic actions that could enable countries to move forward. There's also the importance of enablers, of course, evidence and data, finance, and learning and exchange through the building of movements, communication, information, and education as part of the key enablers that we will need if we aim to accomplish these peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, and to tackle more than 22 sustainable development goals of Agenda 2030. So let me end here. I will stop sharing now my screen, Rachel. As you had asked me, 22 minutes was my time frame. So I hope I made a good introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arturo. Your presentation was really fascinating, and it leads me to several questions for you. But before, I'll give you a little break from speaking and introduce our second panelist for this session and give her time to put her camera on. There she is. I want to welcome Catherine. I'm going to say pronounce your name incorrectly. Tell me how to say it properly, and then I'll introduce you. Aguirre Tobon, who is an economist from Colombia with professional experience in the areas of research on violence and development. Currently, she's a researcher at the Igarapé Institute of Brazil and coordinates the network of women in security and defense in Latin America and the Caribbean. She has worked with think tanks in Colombia and Switzerland. She holds a master's in development studies from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Switzerland. And her research interests includes violence prevention and reduction initiatives, peace accords, and post-conflict gender perspectives and research methodologies. Catherine, we're very pleased to have you with us, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel, and for you to invite me to this important presentation and topic. So I am going, it is correct, the presentation there in the screen? Okay. So I will take the floor to follow up with the presentation of Arturo and showing how Latin American countries, and especially Central American countries, are having the biggest impacts of armed violence in relationship with the flow of weapons from the states, but also in relation to several topics that makes firearms to be in constant circulation in the countries of Latin America and Central America. So I am going to focus in Central America to follow up the discussion of Mexico, showing some patterns about violence in the region, then showing a framework when I try to show that there are some points of diversion of firearms that makes these firearms to be circulating in the region, showing some of the examples of these points of diversion and some strategies that could be used to control this. And this would be very important to try to open the discussion about the several points of intervention that goes beyond the discussion of the civilian possession of firearms. So here I have a very common graph that shows that Central America, that we know, have the highest homicide rates in the world. And that has been constant across the decades. Countries like El Salvador, like Honduras, like Guatemala, are in the top of the homicide rates, even if they are showing important reductions in recent years. But the facts I am showing here are that the highest rates, considering the highest rates across countries and across time, are related with the highest proportion of use of firearms across these homicides. So the countries that have the highest rates of homicides are also the countries that have the highest proportion of use of firearms. Also the years with the highest numbers of homicide rates have the highest proportion of use of firearms. So just to complement here, also we can see that there is a very dynamic legal trade in the region. Even if these countries don't produce firearms, they export firearms to regions. For example, I saw in the information of Contrade some exports of revolvers to Mali and ammunition to Congo. This is something that I found very interesting. And the very dynamic imports to the region. We have US as the main partner, but we have, for example, cases of Colombia providing license and providing fusil legali to Guatemala and other countries involved in this trade, as we see there in that slide, as Israel, Brazil, Canada, providing firearms to the region. But here I wanted to talk more about the points of diversion, and all this I am going to explain is included in a chapter of this book, Gun Trafficking and Violence from Global Network to Local Security Challenge, a chapter of Central America that I know many of the authors of this book are here in this panel. So I think this is a very important tool and a very important resource that people interested in the topic should access this book. So I am going to explain what I include in this chapter that I brought together with Rebecca Peters and Ana Yancy Espinosa. So this is the framework of diversion when I am considering that a big share of the firearms start in a company, in an industry, in a legal industry. Even in Central America, there is a share, an important share of production of artisanal weapons. So starting with the production, we have possibilities of diversion that are, even if there is a lot of documentation that people should feel to make a transfer from one country to another country, there are cases of diversion from authorized transfer. We said, for example, N certificates that are illegal. And I am going to show some examples that in Central America show that this is impossible, this is possible, and this is a source of diversion of firearms. Then when the firearms arrive to the states needs to send the weapons to at least 3 actors: security forces, private security companies, and the civilians. And each of these points, there are possible points of diversion. For example, and I will put the same case for security forces and private security companies, we have diversion facilitated by corrupt members. And we are going to see later the specific examples when we have seen this flow of firearms from legal forces to illegal groups. And especially for the case of private security companies that are, it's like a big hole that has been recognized and haven't been studied a lot in the region, but it's a big hole of weapons going through there. In addition to these corrupt members, there is something related with the insecurity in the stockpiling in the warehouses of firearms. These are very vulnerable, and has been cases of the material being stolen by organized crime groups. Then when the firearms arrive to the civilians, and here I am talking about like a cycle of the firearms, we can see, for example, if the people doesn't renew the permits, these firearms are now out of the control of the government. That weapons also can be stolen for these civilians that have the permits, and that there are many other ways that all these firearms circulate across around civilians. For example, firearms can be brought in one country that have easier normativity to access to the firearms, and they go to other country. I am going to show this example. Other cases are that they flow by the borders very easily, for example, in the ant traffic. And also there are more innovative ways that I'm going to talk here. For example, firearms are sent by mail, by parts, and also, for example, the cases of 3D printing of parts that are another source of that provides the circulation of firearms in any region, but especially in Central America. So showing about these possibilities of diversion, Central America is a region that really shows that this really happens. And for example, in the case of the diversion from the part of the production, I am going to tell you a case that is very important for me because I am Colombian, and there is a case of the biggest shipping of illegal firearms arriving to the hands of paramilitary groups. There were 3,000 AK-47 arriving to the paramilitary groups from Chiquita Banana, that they were involved. It was the involvement of at least 3 Central American countries. It was Guatemala, Panama, and Nicaragua, in a triangulation of permits that allowed the arriving of these firearms to the country. Also, in relation to the security forces, there is a lot of evidence showing, for example, the accumulation of firearms, for example, in relationship with the past armed conflicts, that makes these countries very vulnerable to have these firearms there stored, not very secure, and be able to be stolen by the groups. Also, as I am showing here, there are evidence of officials in El Salvador, in Panama, that show this connection of the security forces with some illegal group. For example, in Los Zetas, they have been in the state's weapons, some firearms with marks of military weapons of the country. As I was saying, the private security companies have shown to be an important whole of diversion in the country. For example, and I am going to highlight this study that showed that of international dialogue, showing that 40% of illegal firearms in circulation in El Salvador are related with these private security companies. So I am showing here that there are many possibilities of this circulation, and in relation to civilians, there is a lot of evidence showing all the types of firearms that they have and the evidence that many of these firearms that civilians has, maybe Eugenio will show that has been identified, that a big percentage, for example, are related to firearms identified to stores in the United States. That this is a discussion I know is going to be important in this panel. So then, showing that we have all these possibilities of diversion, we have all these examples in the region of Central America, there are some possibilities of interventions. There are entry points for the strategy of arms control. And I want here to open the discussion to show that there are more points of action than the common ones that we have in mind, talking about firearms, for example, that is the discussion of civilian possession. Then starting with the point of production and transfers, here is a big discussion. There is a big material that we have in relation with all the bilateral agreements and all the international agreements that exist to try to make these restrictions. For example, we have the plan of action, we have the ATT, that is the International Trade Treaty in relationship to try to provide some provisions to allow these trades, this transfer from one country to another country to be regulated, to identify that there are some countries that are in risk, for example, of a civilian conflict, or maybe, for example, the ATT is considering the high rates of violence against women, to allow the transfer to this country or not, and also to improve all the registration and the tracing of these firearms. This is in the international fora of the agreements across countries. But also, as I was saying, when the firearms arrive to the States, we need to work a lot in all the sanctions of corrupt agents from the states and private security companies to stop this deviation, this diversion of firearms to illegal groups. Also, all the measures of management of storehouses and stockpiles are very important. And I know that organizations like UNODC, like HALO, are working a lot to secure these stockpiles, and especially from the private security companies that are an important point, as I say. So, for example, the ATF also provides computers, training, and access to the e-trace system to allow this tracing from the firearms that are arriving from the States to the Central American countries. And for example, the development of the ID system, that is the ballistic information system, to have this registration more clear. In the part of the civilians, and here I am focusing on this section, on this part that is the most common identified and control strategy, that is the control of the firearms in the hands of the civilians. But I wanted to show that before the firearms arrive to the civilians, there are other points that should be assessed. Then in the civilians, we have at least 2 points of control. One is the control of the demands, and the other is the control of the offer of the firearms. Considering the control of the demand, these are all the strategies related with campaigns, with communications, trying to assess why the people is accessing to firearms, why the people want to have a firearms. So here we need to disentangle, for example, the relationships of masculinity and firearms. And here is a new field, for example, of the arms control that is considered a gender-specific arms control strategy. So this should be considering all the campaigns, all the educational strategy related with the demand, why the people want to have firearms. And the other side is the offer side, the supply, that are the measures aimed to reduce the availability of the firearms, and is related with the regulations that countries have put in place, with all the restrictions the countries have put in place to the people to request a permit. And in Central America, this is very important because all the countries have generated new normativity very updated, for example, considering topics at gender-specific areas. The other one, for example, is to consider education across the storing and the use of firearms. If we already have the firearms in circulation and in the home, considering that a firearm is an important, is a risk to have a firearm in the home, so it should be developed a lot of educational programs to allow that these firearms are safe at home. So this is like this frame that I show of deviation points, examples, and interventions with a focus in Central America. There is my points of contact, but I would like to highlight the Amasuro network. This is a network of women working in topics of security and defense in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now we are almost 500 women working together. So if someone is interested to join, I invite you to go to the website and to go to the Twitter, so you can share the experience across all the women in the network. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Gracias, for such a moving presentation, really about the kinds of research that you do. I want to, I will open the floor for questions as they come in, but I do want to ask you a couple of questions first on my own. And I want to start with you, Arturo. I wonder if you could offer us a bit more detail about some of the science and data practices that have been behind your research on gun violence and their impacts in Mexico. Obviously, your results and findings are fascinating, but I'm also curious from a methodological standpoint and even really a technological standpoint, how you were able to develop this research.
Well, if you are meaning about our estimations on the cost of violence and the cost of armed violence in particular, I think that what you have to understand when we speak of violence as a public health problem, and specifically gun and ammunition related violence, we can have different indicators regarding its impact. The top of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, as I said, for us doctors, is homicide deaths, but also injuries to people that need to go to the emergency room and get trauma care. And many of these patients have lifelong disabilities related to the physical trauma. But what about the mental and the emotional trauma that these people suffer and the related diseases? So when you are speaking about the impact of violence in human communities, you need to consider physical injury, but also emotional and social distress related. So what we did in the model is we estimate using the number of data for robberies, for delinquent acts, for armed violence, using survey data at national level to estimate the amount of crime and delinquency that is occurring with weapons. We can understand the pyramid. We can see that for each homicide, there's a funeral. For each victim, there is an orphan, a family that is left without their dad. So there's less poverty. There's the personal income of that individual, but there's also impacts at every level of the ecological chain. So basically those are parts of our methods to cost all the impacts and to lay out the economics of it. Huge impact on society. Close to 8% of GDP is being lost every year because of violence related crimes and delinquency in the country. And that money could be used to invest in development, to invest in children, to invest in prevention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arturo. Catherine, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the past armed conflicts in the region could be related with the high levels of armed violence that we are seeing now?
Thank you, Rachel. And this is a very important point because it will be not possible to talk about like this topic, no? We have the highest homicide rates in the world in this country that have very long-lasting and complicated conflicts in the region. We have at least Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua with our conflicts. And I have identified, and I have some done research related that there are at least two types of mechanisms that could explain the violence now. One is related with the legacies of the conflict, and other is related with the conditions of the peace. In relation with the conditions of the peace, I am considering countries that live in very economic and social devastation that is related with the situation, for example, of the urban conflict. And this is an explanation that these conditions of the peace is one of the most important causes of the continued armed violence in these high levels, is that the rates, for example, of the cities of the city of Guatemala and El Salvador were high even during the conflict and before the conflict. So it's not only that the rates increased after the conflict, but it was a topic before. And also in the causes, in the conditions of peace, we need to consider also all the legacies in the institutions we have, even if we have DDR process and transformations in the police and the defense system, that there are corrupt still organizations that are very important. But in relation with the legacies of the conflict, we have at least two topics that they were meant, and this is in general for all the countries that have conflict. We have men and women that were left with not many possibilities of work, that they have the knowledge of the work. So they were around the country with this knowledge, but also with the tools. And that is the topic of the firearms. We cannot forget that large volumes of guns and ammunition were imported to these countries, and they stayed in circulation in the countries and in the region. For example, it was identified in the conflict of Colombia of firearms that arrived from these Central American countries. And for example, I have some figures here that are important. Excuse me if I don't pronounce the numbers correct, that I am very bad talking about numbers, but I have the numbers that there is an estimation that in El Salvador, around 360 military type weapons were not recovered as part of the peace agreements. That in the conflict of Guatemala, almost 2,000 of firearms were recovered. And in Nicaragua, only 20,000 of firearms were surrendered in relationship with almost 100,000 of men in arms. So there is evidence that firearms were left in circulation of the country. There is an important legacy of the conflict. Firearms, men with the skills, but also in the conditions of the peace that were not good in the region.
Thank you, Catherine. I think we have some time, as I'm not seeing other questions come in, I have some time to ask more of my own questions, because I always find this information fascinating. And when I have experts of this caliber, I want to learn as much as I can. And Arturo, I know it's a sobering conversation anytime we're talking about gun violence, but it's really heartening to see that there is an audience for this kind of conversation. And so with that in mind, I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we can leverage the breadth and diversity of interest on this topic to achieve meaningful change.
Let me share with you the following thought that connected to the previous comment by Catherine. I believe that there is not a strong opposition by civil society and academics in the region, and the voice of protest and of action against the gun epidemic is not being heard enough within the countries. I see much more organized groups in the United States that are doing much more for the region and for the awareness of the impacts of gun trafficking and gun commerce, much more happening in US universities and international arenas than in our countries themselves. I see that our voices are few and they are very, very silent, I would say. It's not heard. The arguments, it's not heard the discussion, it's not one of the main topics. If you look at newspaper coverage and media coverage, it's practically absent of the discussion. So this is to our disadvantage, Rachel. And let me mention another important aspect. If you look at the top graph, you will see that in the year 2000, there were about 5 million weapons being produced or imported into the US in that given year. This figure has climbed to over 15 million in the last couple of years, around 15 million US guns made. If you add 5 million in 2000, or even go back to 1990 and add the number of guns, you are going to understand that there's hundreds of millions of weapons that have been produced over the years and that have been flowing north to south, and that they are in the hands of civilians or of organized crime or unauthorized users. And these are millions upon millions of guns that are practically in our countries, and that are being used. Why do we have so high crime rates and delinquency rates and organized crime gun power? Because of all these millions of guns that have for decades have crossed legally and illegally into the country. What about all the ammunition that feeds them? Well, it's also coming north to south. So like in any epidemic, we need to stop the flow of these vectors, and we will silence the epidemic. If we get rid of these vectors, much less people will be killed if we do it without guns.
Thank you, Arturo. I see we have a question in the Q&A, so thank you for being brave and being the first one to put that in there. It's a question for you, Catherine, that says, given the breadth of diversion points that you've described, is there an area that the Central American countries should prioritize to strengthen the control of firearms that are coming into and within their countries?
Thank you. Yes, I identified at least there are 2 points that are extremely important, and one is this flow of firearms from United States. Even if the discussion is very centered in Mexico, we have identified that there are firearms in Central America, and these are the countries that have the highest homicide rates. So to join the efforts of Mexico, I think, to generate an integrated regional task force joining all the efforts of Mexico should be a very important entry point. And the second one is the control of private security companies. I was very, very amazed with this evidence that, for example, 40% of the firearms in circulation are identified to coming from these private security companies. I think at least these two are like the key that should be addressed in the region.
Thank you, Catherine. I see that there's another question. I somewhat want to save that question for the second panel if the person who posed it is amenable to that, because I think when we're talking about policy solutions, the question is about groups in Central America or Latin America in general that oppose gun control that are analogous to the NRA in the United States. And when we're talking about policy solutions, I think that question will be quite relevant there. So as long as the person who asked that is okay with that, I'm going to hold that question for a few moments. And instead, I just want to ask Catherine to follow up a little bit. You mentioned the Women's Network in your remarks. Could you talk about the possibilities and needs to include a gender perspective to arms control in the region?
Yes, thank you, Rachel, and Rachel to raising this point because I recognize that all the time I have been working in arms control, gender has been a forgotten topic, and now it's more in vogue. I think it should be important to consider that it's not only a trend, but also it's a powerful way to entry to points that haven't been considered before. And for example, considering this frame, the participation of women, for example, in the discussions, in the international discussions, is an important topic before, like this participation of women in diplomatic and negotiation spaces have been increasing. And also the integration of agendas, for example, the agendas of women, peace and security and the small arms control regime has been integrated only in recent years. And that's been important. For example, there is evidence if women are included in negotiations of DDR processes, these processes are longer and are more stable. So this is an important point. And secondly, in relationship with this, assessing the demand of firearms, it's important, as I said very briefly, the role of masculinity and gun culture. For example, the UN Secretary General have stated that the ownership and the use of weapons are closely linked to specific expressions of masculinity related to control, power, domination, and force. So often the firearms and men are related with this fact that the man protects the family, protects the wife, the girlfriend with a firearm. So this should be considered in all the awareness campaigns. And also in the access restrictions, for example, to limit the access of weapons and provide sanctions, seizure of weapons to people related to topics of domestic and sexual violence. So there are a lot of entry points, and this relationship of women and firearms is like a new and very active agenda in this area.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat that either of you should feel free to answer, which is about ghost guns, which are a very serious and growing problem we've seen in the United States and elsewhere. I wonder if you can talk about if this is also a problem that you're seeing in Latin American countries.
I don't know about ghost.
Arturo, are you finding any evidence or trafficking of ghost guns?
Well, the ability to print guns and to use current internet maps and the dark web with making a real possibility the production of guns from home with freely available printers, 3D printers, is a reality that's come here to stay. So although I don't see that being a public problem right now, we're headed in that direction, as is the rest of the world. So that will just add another layer of complexity to the gun violence epidemic. And I think at the forefront of these efforts, you're going to have organized crime, and they're going to make the fight against them much harder once we are not able to trace a weapon to its manufacturer and distributor and commerce. And in a way, you're already seeing the emergence of innovation in weaponry used by the cartels. One example is the use of drones, for example, to deliver explosives, which are being used against the government forces in this country. And I believe that ghost guns is just another manifestation that times are changing, and that's going to be a new reality early on in this decade.
Thank you, Arturo. We are just, this is sort of a perfect time. We have no more questions in the chat, and I know that it's hard for audiences and for speakers to stay attuned for long times over Zoom. So I do want to give a break here, but I first want to thank Arturo and Catherine, not only for your presentations today, but your phenomenal work that you continue to do on this very important issue. And we're grateful for your commitment and strategies that you continue to employ. Rather than people hanging up, don't leave the Zoom call. Just turn your camera off, turn your microphone off. Take a few moments. We'll reconvene at 1/4 the hour, whatever hour that is in your time zone. I won't confuse people with time. So in about 8 minutes, please rejoin us. We will begin our second panel, and I promise you it will be equally exciting and informative for all of you. So thank you, part 1 of our webinar today, and we will see you in just about now 7 minutes for our next panel. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Hopefully, you can see our participant numbers didn't dwindle, so hopefully you're all still there. We're able to get something to eat or drink for the rest of our session. I'll give our panelists a moment to return. I see our first panelist is on the screen, and really that's all we need. So I will resume this second session, which will really build off the context and foundation that were provided by Arturo and Catherine, and provide, I think, 4 different but clearly interlinked approaches to gun violence prevention and resolution. So for this session, we'll benefit from hearing some perspectives from 4 leading experts. I'll introduce each one before they speak, so you don't have to remember who was speaking next. So our first speaker is Pablo Monroy Conesa, who's a career member of Mexico's Foreign Service and currently serves as the Deputy Legal Advisor at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Within the ministry, he has served as Chief of Staff for the Undersecretary for North American Affairs, or alternate representative for Human Rights and Legal Affairs at Mexico's permanent mission to the Organization of American States, Director for Human Rights Policy at the General Direction for Human Rights and Democracy, and Director for International Litigation at the Office of the Legal Advisor. He was also an international associate at Cleary Gottlieb Steen and Hamilton in New York, and he graduated with honors from Universidad Iberoamericana School of Law and holds an LLM degree in International Legal Studies from the New York University School of Law. Pablo will discuss with us the background, genesis, motivation, case theory, and development of the landmark civil litigation by the government of Mexico against U.S. gun manufacturers and distributors for their negligent and illicit practices that actively facilitate gun trafficking to Mexico. If you are not familiar with this case, I think you're in for a very big treat. And Pablo, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I'm really happy to greet all the other panelists and to greet all the public. Thank you also to the Consortium of Universities for Global Health, also to the Medical College of Wisconsin, and to the Network to Prevent Armed Violence in the Americas. It is a true pleasure to be here with you today. If you don't mind, I'll do this presentation in Spanish, but definitely I can answer all your questions in English, and I'll be switching from one language to the other during the presentation. And I also want to share my screen. So
while you're doing that, Pablo, just to remind participants that you may click on the interpretation button and switch to English or Spanish. Otherwise, you will have the original language. So make sure you pick one or the other. Otherwise, you will not receive translation.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some trouble sharing the screen, so I'll do the presentation as it is, and I'll send it. Well, let's do the presentation like this without slides, and I'll I can share the presentation later with you. So I'll switch to Spanish now. Well, thank you. Bueno, como han platicado muchos de nuestros panelistas, y no será sorpresa para nadie, México enfrenta un serio problema de violencia con armas de fuego. Ya lo mencionaba Arturo Cervantes en su presentación. En 1997, el porcentaje de homicidios dolosos cometidos con armas de fuego en México era cercano al 15%, mientras que en 2022, 2021, 2022 estamos hablando de poco más de 70% de los homicidios dolosos cometidos en México con armas de fuego, ¿no? Esto, pues, sin duda, genera diversos daños a la sociedad, al tejido social en México, detona otro tipo de problemas como, además de la inseguridad, pobreza, por supuesto, falta de desarrollo, el desmembramiento de comunidades, etcétera, y ha incluso llegado a reducir la expectativa de vida en nuestro país unos cuantos años, siendo además un problema que también alimenta la violencia contra las mujeres y contra otros grupos en especial situación de vulnerabilidad. Y bueno, no con poca razón, esta violencia con armas de fuego se atribuye a la acción de la delincuencia organizada, de grupos de delincuencia organizada en México, a los famosos cárteles de la droga, sobre todo, ¿no? Pero también a otro tipo de delincuentes y de criminales en el país. Hasta aquí me parece que todos estaremos de acuerdo, habremos visto esto, no será ninguna sorpresa, pero la pregunta que surge es cómo se alimenta esta violencia con armas de fuego, es decir, estos grupos de delincuencia organizada, cómo obtienen sus armas y sobre todo cómo obtienen sus armas cuando México es uno de los países que tiene leyes muy restrictivas en cuanto a la posesión y al comercio de armas, digamos, entre particulares. Algunos datos: en México solo existe una tienda que está operada por el Ejército, por la Secretaría de la Defensa Nacional, our Ministry of Defense, solo una tienda en todo el país que vende armas a particulares, ¿no? Y también solo el Ejército mexicano es el que otorga permisos a particulares para portar armas. Además, no estamos hablando de todo tipo de armas. Son armas de bajo calibre, ¿no? Y armas que no están reservadas para las Fuerzas Armadas. Entonces, en un contexto, con un marco jurídico y con infraestructura que restringe tremendamente la posesión y el comercio de armas, ¿cómo es que estos grupos de delincuencia organizada se hacen de ellas? Y bien, también ya muchos de nuestros panelistas lo han dicho, conforme a diversos informes, reportes de autoridades, tanto de Estados Unidos como de México, a informes, estudios de organismos internacionales como Naciones Unidas y de organizaciones de la sociedad civil, es claro que la principal fuente de armas que llegan a México y que llegan ilícitamente a México es Estados Unidos. Hoy en día podemos aseverar que el 70% de las armas que son traficadas a México provienen de Estados Unidos. Esto se conoce, ¿no?, una vez que las armas son aseguradas tras haber sido empleadas en escenas del delito, y mediante mecanismos de cooperación que existen entre México y Estados Unidos, ¿no?, mecanismos de rastreo, de trazabilidad, tracing mechanisms. Sabemos que el 70% de las armas que han sido traficadas a nuestro país provienen de Estados Unidos. Bien, pues todo esto que les estoy contando no es nuevo, y evidentemente ha sido una prioridad para el gobierno de México tratar de detener este flujo ilegal de armas desde Estados Unidos. Siempre, ¿no? Desde hace muchos años, décadas, este problema, este fenómeno se había atendido desde una perspectiva de gobiernos, desde una perspectiva intergubernamental. Es decir, México y Estados Unidos tenían en marcha o diseñaban y ejecutaban programas de cooperación para tratar de detener el tráfico ilícito de armas hacia nuestro país. Digamos que el foco de atención, la aproximación era pues, operativos conjuntos, quizá a lo largo de la frontera para evitar que las armas cruzaran, enfocarse sobre todo en la investigación y persecución de los delitos, ¿no? En el delito de tráfico de armas, etcétera. Pero siempre una perspectiva de gobiernos. Hablábamos cuál era la responsabilidad que tenía el gobierno de Estados Unidos y cuál era la responsabilidad que tenía el gobierno de México en este fenómeno. Y sin duda, los gobiernos tienen enorme responsabilidad, ¿no? Y tienen muchas acciones por hacer para tratar de detener este flujo ilegal de armas, este río de acero que viene desde el norte hasta el sur. Y que no, como ya lo han también mencionado otros panelistas, no se queda únicamente en México, ¿no? Muchas veces México es nada más el país por el que cruzan estas armas y llegan también a países en Centroamérica y muchas veces también a países en el Caribe, e incluso hay evidencia de que llegan todavía más hacia el sur, ¿no? Hacia países en Sudamérica. Bien, entonces, como les digo, los esfuerzos bilaterales habían sido la constante, pero estos esfuerzos no habían rendido frutos, ¿no? Los frutos esperados por ambos países para detener este tráfico de armas y la violencia que genera, ¿no? Y con la violencia los daños tan inmensos que genera en nuestro país y en otros países. También habíamos, digamos que la aproximación o la estrategia había pasado por el ámbito multilateral, ya lo han mencionado aquí muchos panelistas, no me voy a detener, pero mediante diversos tratados y en diversos organismos internacionales hemos tratado de atender el problema, la problemática del tráfico de armas. En Naciones Unidas, por supuesto, existe una convención sobre crimen organizado transnacional y tiene un protocolo precisamente destinado a prohibir el tráfico de armas. En el ámbito interamericano existe otro tratado internacional, CIFTA, que tiene el mismo objetivo, prohibir y prevenir el tráfico de armas. ATT, el Tratado sobre Comercio de Armas, si bien desde una perspectiva de comercio legal de armas, pues trata de prevenir el desvío, de evitar el desvío de armas. Pero de nuevo estábamos hablando en su mayoría de la responsabilidad de los gobiernos. Bien, este es digamos, el contexto en el que empieza a surgir, ¿no? O surge esta demanda que ha presentado el gobierno de México. Pero ¿cuál fue la génesis de esta demanda? ¿Cuál fue el triggering event o triggering events que dieron pie a esta demanda? Bien, pues en 2019, el 3 de agosto de 2019, un sujeto armado ingresa a un supermercado, un Walmart, en la ciudad de El Paso, Texas, y siendo adepto él a la doctrina del supremacismo blanco, anuncia unos minutos antes que pues abriría fuego o que llevaría a cabo un ataque contra personas mexicanas o de origen mexicano en esa ciudad que estaban invadiendo ilegalmente Estados Unidos. Así que durante 10 minutos este sujeto abre fuego en esta tienda y cobra la vida de 23 personas, de las cuales 8 eran mexicanas, y deja heridas a otras 23 personas. Esto es quizá el mayor ataque que ha sufrido la población mexicana y la población de origen hispano en Estados Unidos, y por supuesto que desde las primeras horas, una vez que tuvimos conocimiento sobre este ataque, el presidente de la República de México, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, y el canciller Marcelo Ebrard instruyeron a que se atendiera a la población afectada, pero también a que se atacaran o se atendieran las causas que habían dado pie a un incidente de este tipo. Y en concreto, a la consultoría jurídica del Legal Advisors Office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, la instrucción que nos fue dada fue analizar todas las acciones jurídicas, todas las vías jurídicas disponibles para atender situaciones como la que había ocurrido en El Paso y evitar que sucedieran de nuevo. Para nosotros en la consultoría jurídica, en Ministry of Foreign Affairs, quizá, si bien este incidente tenía tintes de, pues eso, de supremacismo blanco, de racismo, de extremismo violento, quizá de terrorismo, un dato que era particularmente relevante es el arma que había utilizado esta persona, ¿no? Es un arma, un rifle semiautomático Buzzer 10, producido por la empresa Century Arms, que había sido adquirida por esta persona de 19 años por internet, mediante una compra en internet, utilizando una tarjeta de crédito que no era suya, ¿no? Y utilizando una identificación que no era suya. Entonces esta persona compra el arma por internet, se desplaza a la tienda, se le entregan, al parecer sin mayor revisión de antecedentes, y se dirige a la ciudad del Paso. El Paso estamos hablando de pocos kilómetros que lo separan de territorio mexicano, y lleva a cabo esta matanza lamentable que les he platicado. Entonces, ese elemento, el arma que había utilizado y la facilidad con la que había conseguido esa arma, esta persona, el atacante, fue un elemento que sin duda nos tenía muy ocupados y preocupados en el gobierno de México. Investigamos todas las acciones legales. Por supuesto que en ese momento, siguiendo lo que han hecho muchas víctimas en Estados Unidos cuando suceden estos mass shootings, estas matanzas en masa, pues fue o se pensó demandar a la empresa que había vendido el arma a la persona. Y estábamos investigando todos los antecedentes y conociendo, ¿no?, estos litigios que ya se habían iniciado previamente en Estados Unidos y que se inician con mucha frecuencia en Estados Unidos en contra de las empresas que venden y distribuyen armas, cuando en el curso de nuestra investigación pues ocurren varios incidentes de violencia con armas de fuego en México. Incidentes en distintas regiones del país, en el norte del país, pero también incluso en la Ciudad de México. Y el común denominador de todos estos incidentes era la presencia de armas traficadas de manera ilegal a México. Armas que no pueden ser comerciadas ni poseídas, ¿no? Ni no pueden poseerlas particulares en México, se encontraban en las escenas de estos incidentes, en las escenas del delito de estos incidentes. Y fue así, creo aquí, cuando surge, ¿no?, la idea, la inquietud de, así como es tan fácil que sucedan estos mass shootings en Estados Unidos, y en particular en El Paso, que fue dirigido totalmente a las personas mexicanas, lo mismo, ¿no?, sucede en México, con armas que son muy fáciles de adquirir en Estados Unidos y que son traficadas también con enorme facilidad hacia México. Los datos que fuimos encontrando pues eran cada vez más alarmantes. Estábamos hablando, conforme a diversos estudios, de cerca de de medio millón de armas traficadas desde Estados Unidos a México. Y evidentemente medio millón de armas al año, ¿no?, estoy hablando de 500,000 armas y sobre todo armas de alto calibre traficadas desde Estados Unidos a México, empiezan, digamos que empiezan a crecer el número hasta llegar a las cifras que tenemos actualmente a partir de 2004. 2004 es el año en el que pierde vigencia el Assault Weapons Ban en Estados Unidos. Una ley, una sección de una ley que prohibía la producción y la venta de armas de asalto desde Estados Unidos, en Estados Unidos. Entonces, es a partir de ese año en el que vemos que hay un incremento ¿no? De el número de armas de alto calibre traficadas hacia México, y por supuesto es desde ese año en el que, como ya lo han mostrado en algunas gráficas mis colegas, sube, ¿no? Empieza a incrementar el número de homicidios dolosos con armas de fuego en territorio mexicano. Bien, pues entonces, teniendo, digamos, como antecedentes todas estas demandas que habían presentado o que se han presentado a lo largo de mucho tiempo por parte de organizaciones, por parte de víctimas, por parte incluso en su momento de ciudades y de condados en Estados Unidos, fue que decidimos que teníamos que agregar un nuevo elemento a la estrategia que desplegaba el gobierno de México para combatir el tráfico ilícito. Y un elemento, ¿no? Digamos, incluir en esta ecuación ya no un elemento desde la perspectiva o una vía de acción desde la perspectiva de la responsabilidad de los gobiernos, sino también, ¿no? Incluir aquí la responsabilidad que tienen las empresas que producen, que distribuyen y que venden armas. Lo que queríamos era irnos hacia la fuente, go to the source of the problem, ¿no? Nos damos cuenta que estas empresas, para hacer crecer su negocio, para maximizar su negocio, pues incurren en diversas prácticas y políticas comerciales negligentes e ilícitas, ¿no? Y ese es digamos, el punto medular de la demanda que presenta México. La demanda que presenta México es una demanda básica de tort law, responsabilidad civil, civil liability, ¿no? Que nos dice la doctrina de la responsabilidad civil, el tort law, cuando una persona comete un daño por una acción u omisión negligente o ilícita, está obligada a reparar ese daño y a cesar esa conducta o esa omisión. Entonces, pues todas estas conductas en las que incurren empresas de armas que producen y distribuyen armas en Estados Unidos, ilícitas, conductas ilícitas, prácticas y políticas comerciales ilícitas y negligentes, están facilitando que las armas lleguen a México y que causen daños, ¿no? Que al ser empleadas en la comisión de delitos, causen daños severos al Estado mexicano en su conjunto, al gobierno, pero también a civiles, a la población civil. Entonces, lo que queremos es que estas empresas, ¿no? Cesen estas prácticas y políticas negligentes, eso es lo que estamos demandando, ¿no? Y reparen al gobierno de México. Bien, ¿de qué prácticas y políticas negligentes hablamos? Estas empresas son muchas, voy a poner solo 3 ejemplos. Digamos, en el rubro de venta y distribución de armas, estas empresas tienen por política venderle armas a cualquier tienda que tenga una licencia federal para vender armas, ¿no? Entonces estamos hablando de, no importa si la tienda, aun cuando tenga licencia, haya sido investigada o sancionada por haberse coludido con traficantes o por haber vendido armas a traficantes, no importa si eso haya sucedido, ¿no? O incluso si haya sido sancionada, las empresas que producen armas distribuyen sus productos, ¿no? Municiones, rifles, pistolas, a través de estas tiendas. Entonces, aquí tenemos otro elemento más, ¿no? El conocimiento. Saben que estas tiendas finales, estos final vendors, se han coludido previamente con traficantes y aún así continúan vendiéndole armas, lo cual pues permite que las armas sean traficadas con facilidad hacia nuestro país. En el rubro del diseño y producción de las armas, ¿no? También vemos prácticas ilícitas y negligentes. Las empresas no incluyen dispositivos de seguridad que impidan que las armas sean utilizadas por personas distintas a su legítimo dueño. Entonces es muy fácil, esto es lo que promueve, son las ventas a prestanombres, straw purchasers, ¿no? La tienda le vende a una persona que no tiene antecedentes legales, ¿no? Pero le vende quizá hasta varias armas y esta persona se las entrega a traficantes y los traficantes las cruzan hacia México. Si las pistolas, ¿no? Si las armas incluyeran dispositivos de seguridad, quizá no veríamos tanta venta a straw purchasers. Otro tema en la producción y en el diseño de las armas es que no incluyen dispositivos de trazabilidad. Muchas veces únicamente cuentan con un número de serie que es muy fácil de destruir, y de esta forma una vez que son recuperadas en escenas del delito en México, no podemos identificar las rutas de tráfico para poder atacarlas y poder evitar que las armas sigan entrando. Y otro rubro donde vemos estas prácticas ilícitas y negligentes es en la publicidad, en el marketing de estas armas. Muchas veces estas armas están diseñadas y su publicidad está dirigida al mercado negro en México, al mercado ilícito, al mercado de traficantes. Tenemos modelos, por ejemplo, de la marca Colt, con nombres como el jefe de jefes, ¿no? Con atributos estéticos muy atractivos para los grupos delincuenciales en México. Entonces, hay una política de mercadeo, una política de marketing por la cual las productoras están dirigiendo sus productos a grupos de delincuencia organizada en México, a traficantes. Entonces, estos son 3 ejemplos nada más, pero son muchísimas las prácticas y políticas que observamos en las que incurren estas empresas. Así que lo que le pedimos a la Corte, ¿no?, para tratar de ir cerrando, es que ordene a estas empresas a que modifiquen sus prácticas y políticas comerciales, a que se aseguren, a que tengan mucho mayor cuidado de que sea muy difícil de que estas armas acaben en manos criminales. Ya lo decía Arturo, todas estas armas están creando, y esta es una de las causas de acción de México, están creando una alteración del orden público en México. Existe una causa de acción llamada Public Nuisance, precisamente, ¿no? Entonces le pedimos a la Corte que ordene a estas empresas a que, mediante un comercio responsable, a que responsabilizándose de la forma en la que producen, distribuyen, venden y publicitan sus armas, eviten que sean traficadas a México y creen una alteración del orden público. También estamos pidiendo una indemnización económica, ¿no? Estamos pidiendo que reparen, que paguen los daños en los que hemos incurrido. Será una cantidad que será determinada durante el juicio, pero es una parte importante de nuestra demanda. Bien, ahora, más o menos un poco hablándoles de fechas del calendario procesal, cuáles han sido los hitos de este litigio, y cabe aquí resaltar que esta es la primera vez que un gobierno extranjero demanda por la vía civil, es decir, inicia un caso litigioso ante empresas, en contra de empresas productoras y distribuidoras de armas. Nunca antes un gobierno extranjero lo había hecho. Bien, pues nosotros presentamos la demanda el día 4 de agosto de 2021 y se presentó ante una corte federal de Estados Unidos en Boston, Massachusetts. Y ahorita regresaré a este punto. Las empresas demandadas, entre las cuales tenemos a los principales productores y distribuidores de armas, es decir, las empresas demandadas son Smith & Wesson, Colt, Storm Roger, Barrett, ¿no? Pero también tenemos a empresas distribuidores de armas que operan en Massachusetts. Presentaron su respuesta el 22 de noviembre. Y el gobierno de México presentó una réplica a esta respuesta el 31 de enero de este año, y las empresas presentaron una contrarréplica el 14 de marzo de este año. Digamos, los siguientes pasos, lo que viene a continuación habrá una audiencia para presentar argumentos orales el 12 de abril, una audiencia a la que ha convocado la Corte, en la que ambas partes podrán presentar sus argumentos orales, y esperaremos que la Corte tome una decisión sobre si este litigio continúa, es decir, si este litigio entra a una fase de pruebas, discovery and trial stages, o si, como pretenden las empresas, es desechado por completo, ¿no? Ahora, ¿por qué escogimos la vía litigiosa? Y por eso, con esto quiero terminar para dar paso a los demás panelistas y después a preguntas. ¿Por qué escogimos el litigio como una vía. Como les decía, queríamos añadir una nueva estrategia, una nueva vía de acción que no fuese únicamente el foco en la responsabilidad que tienen los gobiernos. E insisto, los gobiernos tenemos mucha responsabilidad y tenemos que hacer las cosas mejores, de mejor forma para que las armas no sigan siendo traficadas. Pero para incluir también al sector privado y para incluir la responsabilidad que tiene el sector privado en todo este problema, el litigio era la mejor forma. De esta manera podemos señalar estas acciones en las que incurren las empresas, estas acciones que despliegan las empresas, ¿no? Pero además también, siendo un litigio estratégico, y por estratégico me refiero a que todo ha sido perfectamente calculado en este caso, visibilizamos un problema, ¿no? Al poder presentar argumentos legales, jurídicos en una corte y escuchar también las respuestas y conocer las respuestas que tienen las empresas, visibilizamos un problema que está ocurriendo, ¿no? Y bueno, para terminar, por último, quiero decir que para el gobierno de México ha sido esto una muy grata experiencia. Sabemos que es un litigio difícil, estamos preparados para seguir litigando y creemos que tenemos buenas posibilidades de que el litigio avance hacia fases posteriores, pero lo que ha sido muy grato ha sido la respuesta tan abrumadoramente positiva que hemos recibido por parte de muchísimas organizaciones, de actores gubernamentales, de víctimas en México y en Estados Unidos. Únicamente para poner un ejemplo, en el momento en el que presentamos la réplica del gobierno de México, la respuesta de las empresas demandadas, se presentaron 7 escritos de amigos de la Corte, amici curiae briefs, uno de ellos por parte de Attorney Generals de 14 estados, bueno, de 3 estados de la Unión Americana y el Distrito de Columbia. Entre ellos están, por supuesto, el Attorney General de Massachusetts, de Nueva York, del Distrito de Columbia, como decía, de Illinois y de California. También presentaron un escrito de amicus curiae 27 fiscales de distrito, district attorneys, de distintas ciudades de Estados Unidos, diversas organizaciones a favor del control de armas, entre ellas, por supuesto, algunas de las que están aquí presentes. Estamos hablando de Giffords, Brady, el Gun Violence Prevention Center, en fin, muchas organizaciones en Estados Unidos, organizaciones de derechos humanos en México, víctimas en México, profesores de derecho estadounidense, profesores de derecho internacional. Así que sentimos, ¿no?, que el gobierno de México está contribuyendo a una causa mucho más grande, a esta causa de prevenir y erradicar, ojalá, la violencia armada, y también de esta forma prevenir y erradicar el tráfico ilícito de armas que tanto daño causa a nuestro país. So with that, I will finish this presentation and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pablo, for that very comprehensive description of the background to the lawsuit, the justification, and the way in which you are attempting to hold those responsible for the massive transfer of weapons to account. I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Josh Horwitz, who is the Executive Director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. He has spent nearly 3 decades working on gun violence prevention issues. He works to develop cutting-edge ideas and strategies for the gun violence prevention movement. In 2013, Josh helped found the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy, which is a group of mental health and public health experts who examine the intersection of guns and mental health. The consortium released a set of policy recommendations designed to promote policies that can prevent those at a heightened risk of violent behavior from possessing firearms. Josh is a graduate of the University of Michigan and received his law degree from George Washington University. He is a visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he teaches public health advocacy and is a regular contributor at The Hill. Josh, I shall turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. Are you looking at my just a full screen slide or my note slides as well? Full screen, okay, fantastic, great. So thank you so much for having me here today and for this great panel. I've learned so much. I've been somewhat involved in the international arms trafficking. I've done a lot of work on domestic arms trafficking in the United States, and I want to share briefly some thoughts I have about some technology that might be very helpful in this to help identify where guns are coming from. And so we've heard a lot about the unbelievable rise in firearms being trafficked to Mexico. We've, I think Pablo did, really laid out a lot of what's going on in the United States as far as why they're making it so easy to sell firearms and get into the United States. And of course, the lawsuits are against manufacturers and distributors that Pablo was talking about. But I want to talk about, there's some really, I think some dynamic technology that will help identify the sales and where these guns are being illegally diverted to Mexico into Central and South America. So I want to talk about something called microstanding. So I'm really glad that Pablo went before me because he talked about this lawsuit. And what I'm showing you right now is a report from the Center for American Progress talking about this new lawsuit, and it's an article about that. And what we're seeing in that picture, that cover picture, is exactly the issue that Pablo was talking about, which is we've got all these guns coming to Mexico and they end up killing a lot of people and they're used illegally and they're trafficked. But what's interesting, I love this picture because there's not a gun in that picture. What is in that picture is cartridge cases. And the reason that is, I find that so emblematic is because when you think about ballistic evidence, you often don't recover the firearm. If someone spent a lot of money on a high-powered firearm or built a firearm, they don't necessarily just leave it at the crime scene. But what is left at crime scene is cartridge cases. And those those cartridge cases can tell where the gun came from if we use the right technology. So I love that picture, and I think it really encapsulates what I want to talk about is how can ballistic evidence help us cut off trafficking channels? So let me start with just a little bit of data here. So in the United States, which is the data that I know best, in 55 cities over the last decade, 50% of shootings did not result in an arrest. So when you think about the issues in Mexico, in the United States, people are shooting each other with impunity and guns are being sold and distributed with impunity. And that leads to a lot of death and injury. In Baltimore, where I'm a visiting scholar at Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, you can see that the 65% of homicides have not been solved. They don't know where the guns came from. They don't, they haven't made an arrest. And there's a lot of discussion, but oftentimes the idea that there's not arrests, there's going to be more homicides. This is a really big problem in the United States, and you can see from this graph put together by the Trace that the cities with the highest murder rates had the lowest homicide clearance rates. In other words, if you can't identify who's doing the shooting, if you can't identify where the guns are coming from, if we don't know where the guns are coming from, then murder can continue to go on with impunity. And you can see that in the graph above, not only is homicides an issue of being unsolved, but when you think about aggravated assault, non-lethal injury, that doesn't cause death, you can see that in many cities, under 25% of firearm homicides or homicides, firearm assaults are ever solved. So I'm going to talk about a new technology that I think can give us a lot of value here. But I first want to give you a very brief introduction to firearms. So if this is I can talk about this a lot more, but I'm just going to give you this very briefly because I only have maximum 15 minutes today. So this is what you're looking at on the right side is a cutaway of a firearm, and that is the cartridge that is sitting on the breech face, ready to go. And when you think about what that is, it's been loaded from the magazine, and there's and the firing pin hits that back of the cartridge, and it discharges the cartridge as a small explosion, and it pushes the projectile down the barrel. At the end of that, the cartridge is extracted, and all of that picture that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation is all the cartridges on the ground from a shooting, and they can be fired in automatic weapons hundreds of times a minute, and semi-automatic weapons dozens of times a minute, but they leave a cartridge case, and they're often found at crime scenes. And so what is a cartridge case made up of? Well, if you look on the left, we think about a bullet. It's actually more complicated than a bullet. The bullet is what the projectile, what goes down the barrel. But the case, the cartridge itself, is often made of brass or steel, and it holds gunpowder. The cartridge holds the gunpowder, the projectile or the bullet, and it's all sparked and started by a primer. That primer is hit by the firing pin, causes a small flash, ignites the gunpowder produces gas, and the bullet goes down the chamber from the forces of the gas. And that all happens, in a millisecond. If you look at the right here, you'll see that when the firing pin hits that primer, it actually leaves a mark, okay? And that mark, as well as other markings, are often used to try to identify where the cartridge, the bullet was discharged by this gun, who has that gun, who is that gun registered, where was that gun sold, who manufactured the gun. That can give you all sorts of clues, not only to solve an arrest, but also to identify where the trafficking channel happened, who sold the gun in the United States, who trafficked the gun. These are all important clues that can help you not only solve cases, but identify where the guns are coming from and who are the bad actors. The problem is that the technology that we rely on to match a cartridge to a firearm is well over 100 years old. And what it does is, when these parts are made in a machine shop or a factory, they're sanded, they're forged, they're printed, and they all leave little marks on the back of that firing pin. And the firing pin, those unintentional marks, which you can see here, are how you try to match the gun to the cartridge. So if you find a cartridge and then you later find a gun on a suspect or in a trafficking channel, you test fire the gun and you try to match these little lines, which are all in the micron level, 25 microns, very, very tiny, and say that looks like that. And the reality is you can do that sometimes, but when you have hundreds of different firearms or really thousands of different firearms, that's time consuming. It's not as accurate as you'd like to see. And the other thing, so about 20 years ago, the government created a database of these unintentional markings, which I have my cursor on right now. And they do match cases, and they do match shooting scenes, and they do lead to intelligence, but not at a very high rate. And so you can find cases where this was very important in solving, but they don't get anywhere near the level we would need to really try to identify trafficking channels on a regular basis. And that's what we want to do here. We want more information. So along comes microstamping technology. This is actually technology that's been around now almost 25 years and has been utterly disregarded by the gun manufacturers. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to know about it. But it could really, when we were talking earlier, Arturo, you were talking about obliterated serial numbers, things like that. This is another way manufacturers can identify numbers so that we can know where what guns fired these cartridges and where they came from. So what you're looking at here in this picture is the tiny tip of a microstamp firing pin, which has an 8-digit code that's linked to the serial number and a barcode around for redundancy. Someone tries to get rid of the code, you'd have just like a barcode you read in the supermarket. That's the tip of a firing pin that gives the effect of a serial number, so you can trace the gun without without ever recovering the gun. And what does that tell you? That tells you who sold it in the United States. And actually, in the United States, it will tell you who purchased it as well, if the dealers are keeping their records as they should. So on the back of that cartridge case, remember I showed you that brass cartridge case, and that primer, right in that, you can see this little number right here. This gun was fired from Smith & Wesson 10, from a Smith & Wesson 10 millimeter gun, 1233. So that gives you that Smith & Wesson 10 1233, and you can see that barcode really well in this picture. Gear code gives you more information about the firearm. So this is a technology that is been tested, is well proven, is commercialized, and something I'm incredibly excited about. Some people say, well, will it wear away over time? So this is a picture of a AR-15, which is a gun that's commonly trafficked to Mexico with after 341 rounds. That just shows that it can be done on an AR-15, which is a really highly trafficked gun. On the right, you can see that is actually a 45 caliber cartridge that's been fired over 8,500 times. And you can still see the clear firing pin impression and the barcode. So it's something that could really, it's not a cure-all. It's not going to stop the flow of guns. It's going to identify who the traffickers are and who the bad apple dealers are in the United States. Microstamping now is commercially available. This is a picture of a machine from TAC Labs that makes commercial equipment, so that gun manufacturers could imprint firing pins and put them in their guns. They could put it right on the firing pin, right on the factory floor. What's called laser job shops could use that. So if a manufacturer didn't want to buy the machine, a laser job shop can do it. It used to be back in the day, there was machine shops. Now, of course, there's laser shops, and they're not uncommon. And this is a very common and affordable technology. To the right is a picture of more of a whole firing pin to give you a picture, idea of what that looks like. And then again, just at the bottom it shows how that is lodged in the firearm. So the thing that's really important here is that a single shot from Microstamp firearm gives you that 8-digit code greater than 97% of the time. And if you recover 2, 3, or 4 cartridges too, you're going to get that code 100% of the time. If you go back to the NIBIN process, which I talked about, the unintentional markings, that's an important practice. We should keep doing that, but that gives you a much lower rate of return than what this does. Because again, you've got to find the gun with NIBIN. In this situation, you've got the gun as soon as you get the cartridge case. You know where it's coming from. So what do I like about microstamping? It quickly identifies the gun used in crime. It's like a license plate, right? We all know how to read a license plate. Yes, forensic examiners need to do this, but it's very common sense. You're not trying to, look at different marks and does that look like this? There's just things that we know, alphanumeric codes. You can link multiple shootings that are used with the same gun. You can identify trafficking channels and responsive dealers. What I like about this, it's a very unobtrusive tool. It's never used. You don't need to worry about it until there's a shooting occurs. It takes a lot of bias out of the system because, again, it's like a license plate. There's a lot of binary ways to look at it rather than interpretive. Also can provide transparency to police. If police use it, it can tell you when guns are trafficked from law enforcement. It can also provide transparency in law enforcement shooting situations. And I like this a lot. The penalties of this are focused on the manufacturer. We are asking manufacturers to do this. This is not something like we're gonna criminalize you for for possessing a gun that's not microstamped. It's focused on making the dealers do this. The makers, the sellers, the ones who are making money on this, do this. So just real quickly as I go through the end, manufacturers have already acknowledged in a court case in California that they can do this. This technology is commercially viable. It's similar to other technology. We estimate the cost of firearm between 50 cents and $5. California has a microstamp law, but the manufacturers are managing to evade it. California's law requires all new models of guns to be microstamped. the gun manufacturers have not sold a new model of firearms in California since this law passed. They're selling new models, new guns, but of older models. So they will do anything. They'll do anything to avoid these laws to help people identify trafficking channels. There are a number of states that have microstamping legislation moving through them: Illinois, New Jersey, and New York. I expect others to join that. And there are also efforts by cities to start thinking about, can we start purchasing microstamp pistols to help that market develop? Here's a better picture of the new machine, the tool that can make microstamp firing pins. And I show that to you because if anybody says to you, they can't be done, here it is. Here's the machine that does it. And by the way, that machine this process is not subject to patent restrictions. So this is something that others could do if they wanted to, but a company called TAC Labs is doing it right now. For those who are more interested in it, want to learn more, you can go to our website at you can go to the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, efsgv.org, and we have a report updating with the newest information on microstamping. So I think this is one tool in a toolbox that can make communities safer and reduce trafficking from the United States into Mexico. If the United States would do this, if the gun manufacturers, I think, are going to have to be forced, which is why I think legal, policy and legal options are the way to go. I think sort of asking them to do it is never going to happen. So there we are, and thank you for your time. And I'm really interested in interacting and answering any of your questions.
Thanks so much, Josh. That was a really informative presentation, and on something that I think most of us don't know such great detail about. So I'm sure there will be questions in the chat after we hear from our remaining speakers. So start thinking of those now. I want to turn to our next speaker, Nason Mani, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Public Health and Policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. His research focuses on the structural and corporate determinants of health, seeking to describe the various drivers and channels through which commercial actors affect equity, the generation of knowledge and public discourse, and population health. To date, this has included examining the funding of research, lobbying front groups and charities that produce and disseminate misleading science about the causes of illness, and the role of marketing in exacerbating health inequities. He was a 2019-2020 Commonwealth Fund Harkness Fellow and currently serves as a consultant to the WHO Global Program on Commercial and Economic Determinants of Health, and as an advisor to the Rockefeller Foundation, Boston University 3D Commission on Data Determinants and Decision Making. So Nason, I see your slides are up. That's a good sign. I shall turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the organizers for inviting me to be part of this important event. I've really enjoyed all the contributions thus far and learned a lot. So as was mentioned, my name is Nason Mani, and I work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the Faculty of Public Health and Policy. And I want to talk about the potential value of framing the firearm industry and firearms as a commercial determinant of health. By way of a brief outline of my presentation, I'm going to first talk a little bit about how we in public health might understand a business that sells harmful products. On the basis of that, I want to talk a little bit about the firearm industry and its relationship to that. And because of that, think through the implications, like what that means for us in health research and advocacy when it comes to considering the role of the industry, like we do for other harmful products. And I suppose the place to start with understanding a business that sells harmful products is to turn to the business that we all understand the most. So this picture is a picture of tobacco industry executives swearing before testifying under oath. The first question they were asked was, is nicotine addictive? They all answered that they believed nicotine was not addictive. And these were all, well-educated, leading businessmen. In the days following this hearing, it emerged that they'd known for decades that nicotine was addictive. And indeed, they were doctoring cigarettes, trying to make them more addictive to outcompete each other, to take sales away from each other and to increase their overall sale volume. And you might be saying, oh, but the tobacco industry is unique. We can't learn that much from the tobacco industry and extrapolate it to other harmful products, to other industries, and to other public health problems. And the tobacco industry is unique in the sense that they got caught in a way that no other industry has been caught. Millions of internal documents and memos were leaked and formed now searchable digital archives. And those revealed the extent to which the industry was engaging in directly harming the population, but also indirectly harming through manipulating science and public debate. And this is an example quote where they say, doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. And the legacy of the tobacco industry is really that. It's a unique window into a business with a strong conflict of interest with population health. And in the emerging field of research, the commercial determinants of health, it has emerged that there are many parallels across a wide range of harmful product industries. It is simply that we don't have the same access to internal documentation. What we have learned from the decades of study on tobacco internal memos are a few key things that I hope will be of relevance as we think about the firearm industry as a commercial determinant of health. The first is that internally, the tobacco industry knew their product caused harms to users and those around them. That was very explicit. They knew this. They knew advertising was a powerful way to increase consumption among existing customers, but also expanding to new customer segments. They knew they needed to advertise to youth in particular as a future engine of growth for their business. The memos also made clear they were motivated not by evil intent per se, they were motivated by profit, pure and simple. And within profit, they were motivated by a fear of litigation. They didn't want to be litigated because that could affect their ability to operate or lead to large legal costs. They were motivated by avoiding regulation because that too can affect their ability to generate revenue. And they were concerned about credibility and image because a lack of credibility or image means it's more likely that they'll be regulated, and it means it's more likely that they might face litigation and have trouble in generating revenue. And it was these two things that led to the range of tactics the tobacco industry pursued over many decades, which didn't just include selling harmful products as much as they could. It included these other strategies, creating controversy and doubt about the products, using third-party organizations and front groups to generate a sense that opposition was bigger than what it was to tobacco legislation, trying to improve their image through poorly evidenced corporate social responsibility efforts, including placing the emphasis on the role of existing regulation or on the role of individual responsibility or parents or, and so on, and preventing evidence-based regulation from happening. And my question to you is, are these really exceptional to the tobacco industry? I would argue that for any harmful product industry, these same issues of knowledge and motives apply very much. Any publicly owned company will be concerned about these same things. And where there's a conflict of interest between population health and profit, these are tactics that are available. And really, this is the heart of the matter when it comes to public health and businesses with a conflict of interest. This core motive explains otherwise difficult questions that we struggle with in public health. Questions like, why does a company claim to be supporting communities while avoiding paying tax? Why do they pay third parties to dispute their product's impact? Why don't they put a warning on the label? Why are they focusing on these poorly evidenced educational initiatives while obstructing evidence-based policy? Why are they funding research to dispute their harms while disputing good evidence that exists about their harms? Why aren't they clearer about how much is good for us? And why are they fighting court battles that they know they're going to lose? The answer to all of these boils down to this simple motive. And in public health, we often lose sight of that somewhat, or feel that this only applies to the tobacco industry. In reality, evidence and research on the commercial determinants of health has shown that this is a predictable and common pattern where a harmful product industry comes into conflict with population health. And frameworks have been developed to show the levels at which companies engage with the wider world to protect their sales and their profits. These include affecting the political environment through lobbying, through participation in government committees and policy, through pressuring international organizations and advocates, through tax avoidance. But it also includes targeted corporate philanthropy, manufacturing doubt about product harms, engaging in corporate social responsibility to substitute effective policies for ineffective ones, and conducting marketing and advertising campaigns to link themselves with important cultural values, to increase the norms around their product use, to tie themselves with elements of national identity or human rights. This is not something that is new to the firearm industry. This is very much a standard approach for a wide range of harmful product manufacturers. Alcohol, asbestos, coal, fossil fuels, many of the same strategies have now been observed. And that includes even our understanding, our knowledge of the harms and how we frame them. That is absolutely a target of these kind of strategies, to even shift the agenda away from what is possible and what the public perceives as possible solutions. And we see these parallels in the context of firearms. One example is trying to frame medical expertise or input as being irrelevant to the issue of firearms not being a public health concern. And this is an example from the NRA, which became very controversial because they said doctors in the US should stay in their lane. Doctors shouldn't comment on firearm issues. It's not a public health issue. And this, of course, led to a huge deal of pushback because many doctors were tweeting images of them having treated gunshot wounds, saying that, of course, firearms is in our lane because of the extreme harm that it's causing. This links to another strategy that we see again with firearms, which is the funding of third-party organizations. So the NRA, the Second Amendment Foundation in the US, these organizations receive funding from firearm companies. Just like in tobacco, they didn't receive funding just from the industry, but they did also receive funding from the industry. This example, Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership, is in an organization ostensibly of physicians who exist to claim firearms are not a public health issue. So this is a very classic tobacco industry tactic of a third-party organization actively opposing an agenda that might lead to restrictions on firearm sales. So they exist to claim firearms are not a public health issue. The same organization, though, claims that firearm hearing loss from firearms is a public health issue. So we need to make suppressors, silencers, much more available to the American public. And this seems so counterintuitive. The physicians would say this. On the one hand, gun harms in terms of murders and injuries are not a public health emergency, but hearing loss from the sound of firearms is a public health emergency. But in reality, this is very consistent from a business perspective. On the one hand, they want to prevent regulation of firearms, but on the other, you want to loosen regulation around silencers because that creates a whole new market of accessories that they can then sell. Right now, silencers are quite heavily regulated. This includes things like expanding to new markets. Again, we know from the example of the tobacco industry that as the market became saturated among men, they sought to change, make gender-specific marketing campaigns towards women, towards minority groups like cool cigarettes and African Americans, and to move to other outside the US, low middle income countries, and boost sales there. And we do see this in recent decades in the context of the firearm industry too. They tried to expand their market by offering a wider range of products covering more circumstances and wider demographics as well. And crucially, in the context of firearms, lethality itself is a marketing feature of the product. So the firearm companies are incentivized to compete against each other using lethality as a marketing component to design more lethal rounds that travel further, that leave greater wound cavities, that can go through barriers, that can go through body armor, that can be reloaded faster. And so we're dealing with an industry that's incentivized in competition with each other to generate more and more harmful firearms. And in terms of the denial and disputation of evidence, again, we see parallels. So these are quotes from a study that we conducted on a range of harmful product industries on a type of argument about complexity that we observed several of these industries making. So this first example is from the tobacco industry in the 90s, where they say cancer is a very complex disease. Many factors have been associated with this disease besides smoking. And they attempt to obfuscate, to cause doubt in the mind of the public that smoking and cancer are linked by linking all these other factors: environmental exposure, diet, virus, heredity, stress. The gambling industry engages in exactly the same strategy by saying problem gambling is complex. It's about the person, not the product. It's about their situation, their culture, their choices, etc. Ultra-processed food and drink companies do exactly the same. We believe obesity is a complex problem. It can't be reduced to the demonization of our products, our ingredients. ExxonMobil said exactly the same thing about fossil fuels and climate change. Oh, the climate's affected by many things: sunlight, clouds, rain, volcanoes, comets, magnets, magnetic fields. It's not just, it's not humans. You can't say that it's fossil fuels only. And the NRA says the same thing. Is there a cause and effect relationship between firearms and suicide? Nearly everything gets blamed for suicide at one time or another: love, hate, religion, pain, boredom, fear, shame. So you see that there's a commonality to the strategies. But what's critically important is that we in public health have not engaged with the firearm industry in that way. We have decades of research on the tobacco industry and, to a lesser extent, the fossil fuel industry, sugar-sweetened beverages, alcohol, gambling. But we really have not dealt with the firearm industry in this way. It remains the kind of elephant in the room. And this extends to the role of illicit product availability and the role it plays for companies. And this was alluded to in the previous presentations, which I'm really delighted about. The tobacco industry actively facilitated global tobacco smuggling for many, many years. And this was found and reported by very, very entrepreneurial health researchers, including Anna Gilmore's group at Bath. This, they found, had several advantages for the industry. Cheaper, untaxed, and unchecked products are easier to buy for new customers. So they're a bottom rung on the consumption ladder. It lowers the barrier to you becoming someone who owns that product. Such products are also easier for people to buy who have little income or who otherwise couldn't legally buy them, such as in the case of tobacco, underage consumers, or people who were in countries that were more strongly regulated. Having a lot of illicit product means you satisfy the demand in your market, and you're almost, by oversaturating it, you encourage the sales to be distributed out past your borders. And that is, from the company's perspective, absolutely a viable business strategy, because as long as the product is leaving the manufacturing floor, it's a sale for the manufacturer, whether it's distributed or used legally or not. Whatever happens after that point, the product is sold as far as the manufacturer is concerned, and they make profit from it. So having talked through some of these examples, what are the implications of considering firearms as a commercial determinant of health? And this is something that colleagues and I argued in a recent article in the American Journal of Public Health. Well, doing this is an opportunity for us in health research and advocacy to more formally study the industry itself as a driver of firearm-related harm, including examining how the firearm industry strategies facilitate firearm harm directly, but also indirectly through influencing things like the knowledge space, culture, debate, policy, and science. It includes examining the role of third-party organizations and advocacy networks that the industry and its associated organizations have built over time, and examining the breadth of triangulating evidence that we have for this, epidemiological, yes, but also doing documentary analyses, qualitative interviews, evidence syntheses, and collecting publicly available materials, just as we did for the tobacco industry. This also allows us to learn from evidence, to triangulate from evidence that now exists for other product industries, but not for firearms, and to build wider coalitions around the kind of initiatives Arturo was talking about. So building coalitions with other aspects of the SDGs, building coalitions with advocates for other harmful products, or advocates who are more widely interested in combating corporate power or overreach or independence or transparency. So I think if you take away one thing from my presentation, it's I think that we in public health, for one reason or another, have been reluctant, and I think wrongly so, to really tackle this as a commercial determinant of health. In conclusion, smoking-related harms were identified long before comprehensive action was taken on cigarettes. It took 30 or 40 years, in fact, from when smoking was linked to lung cancer to when we took really global comprehensive action on cigarettes. What made a crucial difference was the widening understanding of the role of the tobacco industry itself in facilitating that harm and disputing the evidence. And that's what galvanized tobacco advocates, researchers, and government to act, because the public support became overwhelming. No one likes to be misled or used purely for profit. There's a growing body of evidence now that similar strategies exist across a range of harmful product industries, which we term the commercial determinants of health. But there's a large evidence gap and a pressing public need for health research that focuses not just on firearms and bullets, but on the firearms industry itself and its affiliates as a commercial determinant of health in its own right. And I hope that events like this are the start to us doing that much more, especially as more data emerges from things like the lawsuit and associated documentation. Thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge my collaborators and funders. My details are on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mason. I think the most striking thing for me in your presentation was that these were things that sort of you thought about intuitively, that there was some sort of less than honest sort of portrayal of the industry, but how you were able to capture that in sort of a methodologically sound portrayal is really fascinating. And the comparison, I had never thought really about the gambling industry. Certainly, of course, tobacco is the first one that comes to mind. But I just found it so fascinating how you linked sort of the same psychology that is used against the public across all of these different industries. So thank you very much for that very thought-provoking presentation. We're now in our final presentation, and we're doing this in a unique way, so bear with us. We have a video presentation from Lila Sadat, who is unable to be with us today. She is the James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law and longtime director of the Whitney R. Harris World Law Institute at Washington University Law School. She is an internationally renowned scholar with more than 160 books, articles, and essays to her name. Her film, Never Again, Forging a Convention for Crimes Against Humanity, was a laureate of 4 film festivals. She is the director of the Crimes Against Humanity Initiative, a project that wrote the world's first global treaty on crimes against humanity, and the Gun Violence and Human Rights Initiative. and we will hear her video presentation. And then we are incredibly fortunate to have Barbara Frey with us to provide some commentary on Leila's presentation and her own perspectives. You may know Barbara. She's a human rights lawyer. She's a scholar. She's an advocate and is senior lecturer in the Institute for Global Studies and director of the Human Rights Program at the University of Minnesota. Her research interests include gun violence and human rights, disappearances and impunity in Mexico, immigration, women's human rights, and transitional justice. And she lectures widely on these topics. She is a leading international voice on gun violence and international human rights. From 2003 to 2006, she was the special rapporteur of the UN Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights on preventing human rights abuses committed with small arms and light weapons. The subcommission endorsed her principles on the prevention of human rights violations committed with small arms in 2006. Frey has also helped establish several human rights organizations, including the Center for Victims of Torture, Minnesota Advocates for Human Rights, Juvenile Justice Advocates International, the Midwest Coalition for Human Rights, and Children of Incarcerated Caregivers. She herself was the executive director of Minnesota Advocates for Human Rights from 1985 to 1997. We can be no more fortunate than to have Barbara with us, and I'm so delighted that she is able to be a discussant of Leila's presentation. So I will turn it over to Melissa to start Leila's presentation, and I will be back with you to introduce Barbara once again.
My name is Leila Sadai, the James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law at Washington University and a senior scholar at Yale Law School. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in person to interact with everyone today, but I'm delighted to present the findings of my research on gun violence and human rights, which of course is a major problem in the United States. The scope of the gun violence problem in the United States is extraordinary. As I'm sure many other speakers have alluded to, we have tens of thousands of deaths every year. We have a mass shooting at least every day. Thousands are killed by law enforcement, particularly impacting African Americans. 3 million children are traumatized by exposure to gun violence. Firearm access triples suicide risks. Waiting periods have been shown effective, but we don't implement them. And domestic abusers are 5 times as likely to kill their partners if they have access to firearms. In contrast, this American problem is not something experienced in other developed countries, suggesting that it's something unusual, unique, and problematic about the United States. It particularly hits our kids, and I think it was the Parkland shooting, as well as the Pulse nightclub shooting, that really got me interested in this scourge, because all of the languaging when we speak about gun violence in the United States as a lawyer is whether someone's Second Amendment rights have been impacted by legislation. And so as an international lawyer, my response to that is, what about human rights? We've successfully tackled other public health crises. We ought to be able to tackle the human rights of gun violence, particularly since the international human rights organizations and the World Health Organization have concluded that gun violence is largely preventable. And in fact, the problem really is the gun, as Philip Alpers, who was Australia's sort of gun violence czar, who helped Australia deal with its gun violence issues. The gun is to gun violence as the mosquito is to malaria. So we need a more effective legal framework. And the sort of the gravamen of my research is that we really need a conceptual shift. We have to stop talking about gun rights. We have to start talking about people's rights. And so in addition to the public health strategies and community initiatives, the lawsuits, legislation, how can we protect the victims of gun violence? And if our U.S. constitutional framework is proving to be insufficient, which it is right now, what other laws or treaties might be available? So I won't go into this in detail. As you know, there is a Second Amendment case pending before the Supreme Court. I actually argued an amicus in there that the human rights should be taken into consideration. But essentially, the Second Amendment just provides very simply that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Historically, that never conferred a private right to bear arms. And in fact, in 1980, not that many years ago, the Supreme Court reaffirmed that. But in a 5-4 decision in Heller, the Supreme Court found that there was a right to have a handgun in the home for protection. And that has been applied to the states. That doesn't mean that we can't have reasonable gun safety laws, safe storage, background checks, permit to purchase, training. Even after Heller, we know that almost all gun safety laws or gun regulation laws are constitutional. But what's shocking is that after each mass shooting in the United States, we see most of the time the legislative response is to loosen gun safety laws rather than tighten them. So my argument is that we need to look to our treaty obligations and to international human rights. And under the U.S. constitutional structure, treaties are the supreme law of the land under Article 6 of the Constitution. And under the Supreme Court jurisprudence dated back to 1900 or even earlier, international law, meaning customary international law, is part of U.S. law. The United States has ratified a whole series of human rights instruments called the UN Charter, the Organization of American States Charter, the ICCPR, the International Covenant for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Torture Convention, the WHO Treaty, and a whole series of treaties also may apply even if the U.S. hasn't ratified them because they're customary international law. And that would include the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Treaty, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and 2 arms trade treaties that are very, very important. So what are the human rights implicated by gun violence? The most obvious is the right to life, the right to bodily integrity, security of person, health, freedom from torture and ill treatment, special protection for children, special protection for education, participation in the cultural life of the community. If you're worried about being shot in a theater or at a play, you might not go. Freedom from discrimination, because gun violence hits much harder populations, ethnic populations, and people of color. Freedom of expression. We're seeing politicians shot for actually expressing their views. Freedom of religion, freedom of association, right to vote and participate in political life as people stroll past voting areas with submachine guns. So my argument is that, in fact, human rights applies, that gun violence has given rise to a huge climate of fear, caused severe emotional distress, and resulted in significant psychological trauma, particularly with respect to our school children, but even with respect to others. So what are some of the consequences of these human rights that I named? It's all great to have them, but if you can't enforce them or you can't really do much with them, what do you do? Well, you can take a petition or you can make an argument to the various human rights bodies that we have internationally. There's a High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, who's actually not very far from the background that I have. My background is the UN offices in Geneva. There's the UN Human Rights Council. There's special rapporteurs. There's the Human Rights Committee, which supervises the Covenant on Civil Political Rights. There's a committee for the elimination of racial discrimination. The American system has a commission on human rights. There's a committee against torture, and we've already mentioned the WHO. Each one of these entities has already opined that the U.S. gun violence crisis is extraordinary, and a legal framework to control the acquisition or use of firearms is necessary. The OAS has ruled on this in 2016, and I and my team actually appeared before them in 2018 and 2019. We've seen many other UN bodies addressing U.S. gun violence. The Human Rights Council has also taken up the problem of gun violence and its impact on human rights in 2010, 2015, and subsequently in its periodic review of the United States. And why, one could ask, should we participate or comply with our human rights obligations, given that none of these bodies can technically force the United States to do so? Reputation, our leadership. Right now, we care about Ukraine. If we don't also set a good example, it's much harder for us to go to our allies and friends on other issues. Promotion of peace and stability is important, and most states honestly comply with their legal obligations most of the time. Human rights do apply in the United States, but one of the difficulties is that the human rights framework imposes obligations of due diligence. That is, states can't ignore a human rights problem, even when it comes from private violence. They have to act positively. Whereas the US Constitution and Bill of Rights is a very old document, which really devolved around a concept of negative rights. Congress shall make no law. Government shall not infringe. And so getting human rights into US law is harder because we have an old constitution. We also have a lot of barriers to the use of human rights law in federal courts. It's not impossible to get a human rights argument into the federal system, but it's difficult. So petitioners will often then go to the international system. And in 2011, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights found that Jessica Gonzalez, whose children had been killed because her husband had violated basically a protective order and he had shot her kids. The Supreme Court had said she had no right to protection, and the Inter-American Commission said, yes, she did. That was a violation of the state's obligations of due diligence. We have human rights norms by states. Some states have human rights commissions. Some cities do. And we have constitutional rights in our state constitutions that we don't have at the federal level, which is interesting. In fact, my research found one really fascinating case, which was kind of the needle in the haystack, where a Supreme Court said, literally, actually it was an appeals court, I believe, said the right to bear arms must be balanced against the equally important right to life recognized by the Indiana Constitution. So can we effectuate change? Of course, we can use the human rights arguments as advocacy. Amnesty International is doing this. We're starting to see some senators doing this. Michael Brown's family went to Geneva to testify before the torture committee. We also know that human rights really don't have much meaning unless they apply at home. So I hope very much that the conversation that each one of you has today really centers upon what we can do to stop the scourge of gun violence in the United States and its spread to the Americas, because of course what's happening here is afflicting our neighbors, particularly Mexico and other countries in Latin America. And I'm deeply grateful for the work that Stephen Hartgarten has done organizing this, to my co-panelists, and I'm just sorry that I can't be with you today in person. Thank you so much.
I wish that I could thank Layla in person, but instead I'm going to turn over to someone who I think I will be thanking after her presentation, having heard her for many years. So I am delighted to welcome Barbara Frey to the event, and I will give the floor to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks so much for including me in this really interesting conference. My congratulations to the Medical College of Wisconsin for organizing the satellite, and I believe that multidisciplinary approaches are really important, and for a long time, the public health approach has been such a critical approach to the issue of gun violence, and we've learned a lot in the human rights community from your pioneering work. I just wanted to drill down a little bit on some of the points that Layla Sadat has made in her presentation. She raises this idea of using human rights mechanisms in the United Nations as a forum for addressing gun violence issues, and particularly gun violence issues in the United States, and says we all know the United States is the outlier in this regard, and that kind of power dynamic is what in addition to the gun manufacturers' impacts, is a huge barrier for trying to work on the issue domestically, but also internationally. But some of the mechanisms that Leila mentioned, the treaty bodies that enforce our treaty obligations, the Universal Periodic Review, which is a mechanism by which each state has to kind of show its compliance with its promises under international law. They've already been used specifically to make some important findings and recommendations about US gun violence. There also are opportunities for normative developments in the United Nations. What I mean is the creation of soft law standards, then ultimately treaties. So the Arms Trade Treaty is, of course, an example of one of the most important treaties in this area. But in human rights have their own treaties, and sometimes they're general, they cover the whole span of human rights, like the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but it's not without, it'd be well down the road after there's a treaty on business and human rights that we begin to think about specific treaties regarding certain commercial sectors like gun manufacturing. But the truth is, firearms misuse is indeed an issue globally. And so one of the useful things about using this process is it takes the discussion to a higher level. And it allows us to make comparisons in different national and regional contexts. It's, in my mind, a place to hold saner discussions about the issues of gun violence than what is possible in US policy and legal circles. So let me tell you just a couple developments in one of in the most important human rights body, which is the Human Rights Council, which is the legislative branch of the United Nations that deals with human rights. There are 47 state members. It's a political body. Russia and China are members, as well as the United States, which right now means that there are often tensions on these issues. But it's a place that if you can reach agreement, that it does create new norms, and it's a place for comparative research. So since 2015, as Leila mentioned, the Human Rights Council has called for 3 high-level reports about the impact of civilian acquisition, possession, and use of firearms. And then a couple other reports on the impacts of weapons transfers, which would be relevant to the cross-border discussions we're having in this meeting about the US-Mexico case. So these alternate. So every year since 2015, there has either been a resolution on civilian acquisition followed by a resolution on transfer. Now, the thing that's interesting to me as a longtime observer of the UN is that there's been no previous work on these issues by the political bodies. These were always seen, gun issues, or in the language of the UN, small arms and light weapons issues, were always seen as security issues, and they were not in the realm of human rights. When I completed my study in 2006, the Human Rights Council refused to take it up as requested by the subcommission. We asked them to endorse the study and the principles, but the United States was a member at that time, and no other country dared to bring up the gun issue because of the power imbalance at the time. And that was the status quo until 2014, when Ecuador and Peru began to take the lead in resolutions on these arms things. So I won't go through the details, but I can direct you to right now in the Human Rights Council, and there's a 2022 report that is being discussed in Geneva on the availability of firearms, and it's their impacts on children and youth, both children and youth as users or misusers of firearms, but also the impacts on their array of human rights. And the report of the High Commissioner is, fairly good on this regard, though I was a little bit disappointed to see that they're in their recommendations, they have pretty weak language suggesting that states should consider adopting stricter requirements for the legal acquisition and possession of firearms. It really didn't seem like a big leap to say that they should adopt. So the language continues to get watered down in recommendation. Let me just comment briefly then on the use of human rights mechanisms in the United Nations in particular, but the kinds of international law strategies that Layla was suggesting. Let me just talk about the pros and cons of using these. Let's start with the cons and we'll end on a positive note. The cons for using international law in the US human rights debate is that the same sector of US society that supports Second Amendment civilian acquisition and possession despises the United Nations and all global institutions, and they fight against the impacts of globalization in US politics and economics. So US civil rights litigators have long known this, and they've avoided bringing international human rights norms into US cases. So Layla and her team are heroically trying to do this, to use US courts to bring in these concerns, but it's a high barrier. It's a very high barrier. And even if the United Nations did have popular support, it has so far very weak language, as I've suggested, and a very weak enforcement mechanism. Even though states like the United States and Mexico are, considered reasonably good actors in the international sphere, there's not a lot of bite there from a legal courtroom status. Even within the United Nations, the US can continue to ignore these efforts. And as we have on other issues like racism and indigenous rights. And there's a politics to this, which is that Russia and China and other states that really dislike the United States' hegemonic power often use these issues to diminish the US's efforts to promote human rights globally. And so it just becomes one more issue that's being raised by anti-US forces in the UN, and the US can distance itself. So those are the cons, let's be honest. The pros, I would say, is, I reiterate, it's the same place for discussion and documentation. So the kinds of academic and advocacy research that can be done and used in places within the international advocacy sector that we don't have as many opportunities in the US for those discussions. And this regards two issues in particular with regard to gun violence. The first is registration of weapons. So all of the reports that are coming out of the UN on gun violence and human rights, starting with my principles in 2006, but now picked up through these Human Rights Council reports, recommend the registration of civilian purchase, something that's totally obvious to anybody who ever has studied this issue, but something that the gun lobby fights tooth and nail against because they do not want to raise the specter of their liability. And the second issue is self-defense. And I often plead to my lawyer audiences that, that they write law review articles on this issue of self-defense, which has been manipulated by the gun lobby as a basis for gun ownership, as including sending their folks to state capitals with placards that read self-defense is a human right. And the reason they say self-defense is a human right is because they want a freestanding Second Amendment issued globally for all individuals to be able to own guns. And the United Nations and other international organizations are alternate sites for conceptualizing this issue of self-defense, which firmly fit self-defense in the context of necessity and proportionality across these norms, but also recognize that it's not a right. It's not a freestanding right. It is an exemption from prosecution or from criminal responsibility for taking a life. And that's a really big difference in international law and a place where the international community can really make a contribution. So the United Nations is not the main place or the only space, but it's a good alternate space for normative development and comparative research that we can use then as a boomerang in our discussions about US gun regulation. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you, Barbara. I think those were really insightful comments and put a great context as well to Layla's presentation. We are running short of time, but I promised someone from the first session that we would get to his question in this session. So I'm going to open it to any of the panelists who want to answer the question about whether or not there are groups in Latin America, or perhaps in a particular country in Latin America, that oppose gun control that are analogous to the NRA in the United States. And of course, we can talk about how the NRA has gone global in much of their advocacy work, but I just want to make sure we give our panelists time to answer that question. I'm not sure who wants to take that one. Nobody wants to take it?
I don't know. So I'll give you that.
Yeah, Rachel, I would say I really, I mean, there are of course groups here in Mexico that are advocating for more relaxed gun laws and a more access to guns for particulars. But I mean, with that power, a power similar to the NRA or not, I wouldn't say we have some. Of course, the drug cartels wouldn't want to have more control on guns. That's for sure. But
yeah, I would just add that the most important case is the Brazil case. I mean, which indicates the influence of the NRA globally. And in the Brazil case, there was a referendum that was up for the public, and the public strongly favored tighter gun regulations, and the NRA came in and put in a lot of money and effort and trained their local allies in Brazil on how to use the kind of messaging that Nasan Mani told us about, and they ended up defeating that referendum. So it's the NRA and pro-gun and the gun manufacturers, they're the ones who have profit motive. They're the ones who are funding a lot of these false grassroots organizations that are promoting gun rights.
Thank you. I have been reminded that we have now it's down to probably a minute and a half left of this session before it is needed, this Zoom room needed for other side events. And so we didn't get to all of the questions that I had prepared that I know we have remaining from our audience, but that is just to me indicative of the interest in this topic, in the multidimensional, multifaceted approaches, the cross-cutting approaches to the issue of gun violence. And I think we've really just started to scratch the surface of both policy, technological, philosophical, legal, approaches to curbing gun violence in this hemisphere. Thank you to those that stuck with us for the entirety of the 3 hours. I know it is a very long afternoon, but I think that the caliber of the presenters, the quality of the work, and just the fascinating research that they provided hopefully made it seem much faster. I wish you all good health, continued resilience, and thank all of you for joining us today.